Welcome to another edition of the Reidsville Chamber of Commerce News and Views Show. I'm your host, Diane Sawyer, president of the Reidsville Chamber of Commerce. Today's guest we have with us, Demarcus Andrews with the Center for Responsible Lending. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. I am very excited to have you. And I will just say, we have a little bit of construction going on. Yep. So welcome to the Chamber and the Visitor Center. And in 2023, we have the streetscape going on. So for all of our folks listening, if you hear saws and construction, we are beautifying our front door out here. So
absolutely. And Durham is in kind of transition as well, so I'm used to it.
And I just mentioned on another show, I said, you know, everywhere you go, there's always construction from Greensboro to Durham, all the way to New York City, and people grumble and gripe about it, but then the outcome is always so wonderful.
Absolutely.
So it's worth it. Trust the process,
agreed.
Right?
Trust the process.
Okay, so tell us about your role and who you are and what you're doing, and just give us some background about your organization.
Absolutely. So my name again is Demarcus Andrews. I'm the Director of Outreach and Engagement, as well as the North Carolina Policy Manager at the Center for Responsible Lending. And if folks aren't familiar with our work, so we work on credit and debt issues that impact vulnerable and communities of color. And the focus there is to make sure that our marketplace is fair and inclusive for all, and regardless of where you fall on the financial spectrum. But the underbelly of the work is really about building and protecting wealth for communities of color, which is super, super important.
It's so important.
Yeah.
It's so important because, and not to interrupt you, but when you say building and protecting wealth, one of the things that we were talking about is we're going to have this topics at 12, and it all relates back to students. And a lot of times folks get into so much trouble in their college years, and they can't ever come out of it.
Yes.
It affects their life for the rest. So like that piece and that, just those words are so important to me.
Yes.
So protecting and building wealth, carry on, please.
Yes. And it is, so my lived experiences is really why I came to the center and wanted to do this work. And I'll say I grew up in a single family household. And so single income, and my mother really, sought out wealth, and from her knowledge, home ownership was the key to wealth building. But my mom was also a single mother who was a provider, who was always working. And so staying abreast to what a mortgage loan is, and, all the different, intricacies that goes into a loan. And so she got herself into a really bad loan. And we almost lost our home in the foreclosing crisis around 07, 08. And I didn't know it at the time, but it was really impactful to the way I sought out education. And, following, my professional program, I sought out the Center for Responsible Lending because it really focused on education, which is a huge part of how you bridge kind of that gap between, that racial wealth gap, and really understanding a mortgage loan and how we build wealth. And so I wanted to get into that. I wanted to be a part of it. And that's really, how I came to the center. And I can talk about all the educational things that I've experienced, which made me a great person for the job. But I'm really an advocate for bringing life experiences to bear in your work. I feel like those minute details on how you problem solve with policy solutions, I think is key with having those lived experiences. So I say that's who I am. My lived experiences has, that morphed me into the person I am today. And I say it was really huge on why I do the work that I do with the Center for Responsible Lending.
I think that is truly an amazing story. And I think you need to capture that and continue to tell that story.
Yeah.
I also, one of the things that we talk about with workforce and with building our workforce, we talk about our students, and we have gone in and repeatedly talked to them about, I took a whole panel of people to the high school, and I was, all different walks of life, all different jobs and careers, but we were all doing something that we were really passionate about. Something that my degree, I mean, and that's the same thing, like snippet, my background's in public health education. But here I am at the Chamber of Commerce because my nonprofit journey brought me to this nonprofit.
Right.
And instead of helping people with health and wellness as it relates to preventing that, I help the community and help our businesses and help our organizations and our nonprofits. So when we talk about connecting our workforce and we go in and we talk to the students and we're trying to build a path of workforce, and that's something that the chamber works on, and we have, you know, a committee, and we work with the school system and we work with our local community college. And when we talk about, you know, the answer's always been 4-year school. It doesn't matter what degree you come out with, it's never going to be enough to compensate for that debt that you've built up for thousands of dollars a semester.
Right.
And I think that is the key now, especially post-COVID and the workforce transitions. And one of the things that we've talked about off camera is, you know, your situation and your family and the opportunities, and it's been the same with me, the flexibility and the ability to work from anywhere. So I think that we talk about how to explain that that's not the answer, and that it doesn't matter what kind of, if we're trying to build wealth, that's not the way to go about doing it. And I think that that's along the lines of the work that you all are doing. And I know that we were connected by NC 100 and by Merrill Holloway and by the work that he does, and wanted to give back to Reidsville and Rockingham County as the rural community that he came from.
Right. Agreed. Merrill is definitely, you know, someone I like to call a friend at this point. We've definitely like connected over, you know, his love and yearn to build, you know, community within Rockingham County. And as well as the Centers for Responsible Lendings yearn to build relationships in Rockingham County. So the idea was that at some point we'd find some synergies amongst, you know, financial issues that we both care about. And when there's opportunities at the General Assembly, that we're able to lift up voices from the folks that are on the ground who see the impacts of, you know, different financial issues, but being able to lift those voices up to advance our collective goals. And so we came up with an event series where we initially had kind of a virtual kind of conversation with, you know, Rockingham County community, where we just wanted to hear from them, like, what are you impacted by as it relates to financial issues? And so a couple of things came up. So you mentioned the student debt piece, in which was kind of related as well to the, you know, college readiness. And so, you know, having juniors and seniors, you know, making some really intentional decisions about how you finance secondary schooling. So we'll have an event that's oriented around student debt relief, which is kind of on everybody's mind right now. I know it's definitely on mine because I could definitely use some. But the 10 to 20K debt relief, I know folks are really interested in hearing about that. So we have an expert that will come in that will talk about kind of the latest on student debt. We'll have a college advisor come in and talk to, you know, or talk about you know, some best practices to consider as, you know, juniors and seniors are entering into applying for secondary schooling. Another issue that came up was installment loans. These type of loans can really, you know, wrap community up into cycles of debt. And we know this through research that many folks are taking out these really high installment loans. And so one of the things we wanted to do is come in, talk about how North Carolina regulates loans up to $15,000, talk about the difference in business and consumer lending, and how, you know, the movement is to actually raise the interest on these loans. And so wanting to talk about that. And then the third issue, which I think is a really acute issue to rural kind of North Carolina, is heirs property and the protection of land that has been passed down, you know, to the descendants.
And why do you think that's so? Why do you think that's so key? Explain, because I don't know that people actually understand like what heirs property is and why it isn't really regulated. I have learned from my real estate friends that there can be a lot of issues
Yes.
with heirs property.
So it's really important because many families have properties that are the centerpiece to generational wealth. And the way North Carolina law is currently constructed, the descendants of the owner of the home could actually, them owning the home could actually participate in them actually losing it based off of North Carolina law. And so one of the things we wanted to do is have an expert come in, talk about ways that we, could be kind of preventative when it comes to, folks keeping their homes within their families. And so we'll have an expert come in and talk about this, and also why it's acutely important to rural North Carolina to actually change the law in a way that it protects, these centerpieces of wealth in these generations of families.
Yeah, because a lot of times too, they don't realize the difference in the home or the structures and then the land itself.
Right.
And there's so much around that and the way that things are written or documented, and can be really life-changing for people.
Yeah, it's such a very convoluted process, and it's complicated, and it's one of the reasons why I think it's super important that we are able to bring in someone who could, talk in layman terms to people like me who don't really fully understand heirs property, but it's super important because I think about my family, and I think about why me and my wife decided that we wanted to own a home. And it's super important for us to be able to pass something down to our kids. And so we're already having conversations about wills and writing in how we want our properties, split up, amongst our kids. And so proper planning, I think, is super important to making sure we keep these centerpieces of generational wealth in our families.
I absolutely agree with that because it's interesting, and I think that some of our members and our business leaders will find it. It was not that long ago that I had a real estate agent call me and say, Diane, I've got this issue. I've got these folks, and they, don't live in the home, but they want part of the property, and the land is so large, but there's a structure and there's no record of anything, and they were renting it to such and such, and now they're not, and the person passed away, and there's all these things, and I'm just like, oh my goodness. And so, thankfully we have a really great clerk of court's office here in Rockingham County, and so I was like, let's call them and let's figure out what they can help you with and where we are. But this agent was like, I've got this client and I'm trying to help them and I can't help them and I don't know how to help them.
Right.
And it really, and it's so interesting. My grandparents lived in Danville, and my mother still owns a house there, and they were smart enough to do that. But we had to open her estate in my grandmother's estate here because she ended up at the Penn Nursing Center because it was closer for us. So then she became a North Carolina resident in the last 6 months of her life. And so it is crazy, how all of that stuff works. And if you don't have the right people, and if you don't have the right resources, and if you don't know, which is why it's so critically important for communities, and for rural communities, and for people who have no idea, don't know. And that all goes back to what that you were saying about wanting to make sure that populations and folks who don't have access to those things can do that.
Yep.
So,
well, I always come back to my lived experience and the lack of information that my mother had before entering into a mortgage loan. She was told that this was the American dream. Owning a home is the key, to building wealth for your family. And my mom had done all the things right. She got up, she worked every day. She didn't do drugs, she didn't drink. She made sure she had a system of support that was, outside of the home to make sure that, when she was working, we had care. She was doing so much that, she couldn't take time to just learn what it is to own a home. How do I pass this down to my kids? What resources, can I be connected to make sure I keep and stay into my home? And it's, like I said, it's really, it was really impactful part of my life. And the reason why I like every moment I get, connecting folks to resources and experts, it's what I think my life calling is. Because it's so important. The lack of information is how the lenders take advantage of community. And so it's as much as I can, connecting folks to resources and experts, because I don't know it all. I barely know anything, but I can definitely be a connector, which is a huge part of my work.
Which is also a huge part of what I do, which is how we were brought together.
Right.
But I don't know that I don't know, it's been a long time since I've said it publicly, but I don't know that I've ever talked about my personal experience on a News and Views show. But it's funny that you say that, because while different, my parents were 15 and 16 when I was born. And my dad has always been a really hard worker. Like he wanted the best for my brother and I, and he, you know, it was always about trying to build wealth through, so he put my mother back through nursing school. Right. So they both had their GED, and then my mother went through nursing school. And he had a plan for my life so that my life wasn't like his, and that it didn't want me to work as hard as he had to work for the things he had to work. And so it was always, you're going to finish high school and graduate high school, and then you're going to go to a 4-year college. And then, but when it all came down to it, he still couldn't pay for that 4-year college because he was so busy doing all the other things. And unfortunately, as teenagers and teenage relationships often do, my parents divorced when I was a senior in high school. And along with the loss of his mother, and he was adopted, so there was a lot of there's a lot there with he and his brothers. And so, you know, I think back and I'm like, would it have been different had I gone to community college? Or would it have been different? Like my 20s and 30s even have been shaped by my student debt. It didn't matter. Doesn't matter what job I've had or haven't had or whatever. And it's funny because my husband, who did go to community college and did learn a trade and he's like, it blows his mind. He's like, how do you have all this debt? Like, what is this? You know? And so, and I was not going to get emotional when I started talking about it, but it just makes me think, like, and people from all walks, like their experience is different, whether it was teenage parents or whether it was, you know, a single parent home or whatever. And I grew up with a neighborhood where there are a lot of different cultures and a lot of different populations of people, because we were, again, you know, we were we were lower middle class. But in Rockingham County, even, you made the comment when we were off air and you were talking about the have and have nots. It's like that in Rockingham County, specifically like in the city limits or in the county. The have and have nots, it's very distinct, and the neighborhoods are very distinct. And so, like in our neighborhood, we were just a melting pot of all kinds. I mean, we had folks that even didn't barely speak, really, the parents didn't speak very good language because they were from India or from Pakistan, and they owned small businesses. But I really don't know how they made it, like how they operated those small businesses, not being able, so they were making those same kinds of decisions for their children and not having all the information and not having the right resources and the right tools. So everything that you're saying, to me, it's so impactful, and it could change the course of a child's life, of a family's life. And so that's why it's so important to me for us to host these topics and these seminars, and for us to reach as many people as possible. And I just think that, you know, the work that you're doing is so important. And I mean, there are things that have caused arguments between my husband and I, like over, he's like, I mean, when are you going to stop writing the North Carolina College Foundation, like, when are you going to stop writing them checks? Like, you know, and I'm just like, eventually, one day, you know, it'll, whatever. But yeah, I mean, it's, and especially like for generations where they're first generation college students or first generation high school graduates, and they're trying to figure out what to do with their lives. And it could, a student hearing that information, or a parent or a grandparent or a guardian or
Right.
somebody who's a part of that care system, like what you were saying, and understand how those things work, because unfortunately not all lenders, and obviously the lender who was the lender for your mother didn't care, didn't bother to ask her
Yeah, it
any
was
of the
Bank of
questions.
America.
Yeah.
Yep,
Okay.
Bank of
And
America.
so, and it was probably just somebody doing their job, and so, and it's funny that you say that, because we have a couple of different financial institutions who service Rockingham County. Piedmont Advantage Credit Union, who has the branch in Eden, their branch manager is huge on when people come in to get a loan. She does not just let those things go through. Like, she talks to them about what is your budget, and like, what have you, she tries to do like that financial education piece and say, okay, that's great that you want to go do X, Y, and Z. And I'm not trying to get into your business,
Right.
but I don't want you to be in a situation, because they're members. And a lot of times
Yes.
with the credit unions, they approach things differently because they're members. And so she will say, like, okay, if this and this and this happens, like, what will you do?
Right.
And a lot of times they can't answer that question. And so, they try to do that educational piece. And there's some other credit unions, the State Employees Credit Union does a program with the students where they try to teach them about different jobs and different salaries and budgets, and how quickly, like, a monthly budget can be blown by one bad decision or one wrong decision.
Yes.
And so, that's what the chamber is trying to do, is connect all of those people and all those things that are happening, so that we have kind of a streamline. So I think that we are really excited to be hosting these events, and I think that being brought together by Merrill is probably going to be a beautiful partnership, and
Absolutely.
so excited to hear more. We're probably running short on time, I think, at this point. So is there anything that you want to add about yourself, about your organization? I know that you mentioned you've got multiple titles. Do you want to touch a little bit on the North Carolina piece?
Yeah,
I don't know that we
yeah.
did that.
So the bulk of my work that I do for the Center for Responsible Lending is in North Carolina. And I'd say the focus, so I've been at CRL for about 2.5 years at this point. And the huge kind of area of focus in North Carolina for us, which is a bill that we've been pushing, is the Student Borrower Bill of Rights. And so it gets back to all of the things that we were talking about. We talk about how the lack of education around understanding, the different loans that folks are getting into to fund their education. So many of them, like especially communities of color, they come from families that don't have much money and much family wealth, which is also why it's so important for heirs property issue.
Correct.
But when we think about the lack of information and the servicers who are supposed to act in the best interests of the borrower in order to get them to, the optimal repayment route, in order to actually pay off their loans and become
Right, because they
productive
want their
citizens.
money back.
Yeah, that's the
That's the
the
point.
goal. Yeah. And so what we've seen through research is that servicers are engaging in behaviors that are ballooning the debt loads of borrowers. And so one of the most important things that we've done, or at least advocated for at the General Assembly, is for a set of standards and to require the servicers to be licensed within our state. So this would require them to open up their books to the Commissioner of Banks on an annual basis and to basically review their books to make sure they're doing their job. And because what we've seen is that they've misapplied payments from borrowers that have resulted into their accounts becoming delinquent. And we know that's reported to the Credit Bureau, and we know the huge impacts that credit, bad credit can have on an individual's life. And we also know that they aren't enrolling students into the optimal plan. And so many students will, which is a normal thing, have a financial shock throughout their life, which is losing a job. And when you've been paying on your payments, this is, or paying on your loans, this is, pretty pivotal. And so you call your loan servicer and who you think is supposed to act in the best interest of the borrower. And you tell them, like, I can't pay this month's, bill. So what can I do? And you depend on them for these answers. And what we've seen is that they've enrolled borrowers into plans like forbearance plans, which forgoes payments for about a year, but it adds interest onto their loans. And what we've seen is like pretty hefty debt loads that are concentrated just around interest. And so we think that this bill is super, super important to helping alleviate some of the burden that student debt and servicers have played a role in that. And so I'd say that that is something we'll be pushing again this year. And if that folks want to plug into that issue, whether you have stories about the impact of debt, whether you have servicer stories about them not acting in the best interest. Literally, you had a CEO of Navient, which was one of the big loan servicers in our country. They're no longer a servicer, which is a great thing. But their CEO literally said, "We will not act in the best interest of the borrower." And I think that illustrates why it's so important that we within North Carolina, we passed this bill to set servicer standards so that they act in the best interest of the borrower, because we depend on them. We depend on them because we come from families that have lack of wealth, and we are depending on loans, which, like myself, I didn't fully understand what an unsubsidized and subsidized loans were. And so when I'm paying back my debt, it's just like, oh, okay. So if there are folks out there that would love to plug into this work, please feel free to hit me up.
Absolutely. And we will have your information on the screen, and then we will be having these topics at 12, which are going to start on January 31st.
Yes.
And they will be every 2 weeks, and we'll run through the end of March, actually, as we partner with another organization and have some additional topics about passing on not only heirs property, but small businesses and being able to pass on to the next generation when you do not have an heir behind you to carry that on, and employee ownership in small businesses. So,
Yes.
Well, it has been a pleasure
Same.
today. I am so excited. I feel like I've learned a lot and thought about things that I probably haven't thought about in a while, and kind of brought back some of that because it is really important. And I think at the end of the day, the culture of not calling your borrower and not having those conversations comes out of you weren't getting what you needed anyway. So, and people, and if people are trying to do the right thing,
Right.
they should be rewarded with doing the right thing.
Exactly.
So I think that's important. So
Agreed.
such a wonderful conversation. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, there's nothing more. I really appreciate the time, and I look forward to our relationship and building more community and synergies amongst our work.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank
you
you.
for sharing your work with us.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, that is it for today's episode of News and Views. As always, you can find us in downtown Reidsville at 140 South Scale Street. You can find us online at www.reidsvillechamber.org, and as always on our social media accounts. And we'll see you real soon.